fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
I wanted to talk about this book that really ties into the last book we were talking about, which was The Reign of Quantity and the Sign of the Times by Rene Juanon, which is how I'm going to pronounce his last name because I don't know how to do it. And our top comments in our videos are people correcting me on pronouncing people's last names. Like, what was the last one? It was on ideology. It was like, it's Althusser, like loser. I'm like, okay, okay, I got it. It's going to be the top comment of every fucking video. It's
Probably.
It's David Icke, like Dyke. Buddy. But this is a really great book. It's called Anthropomorphics by Dennis Bouvard. And it's a really short book. It's by Imperium Press, a very good independent publisher, as we mentioned before. Hold on, let me just get the book here. Now, this is ties into like classical civilizations, pre-modern civilizations, and getting into the anthropology and history of it. And it's a very interesting book. It's called Anthropomorphics, an Originary Grammar of the Center. So it deals with mainly linguistics, mainly with English and communication, but it's about how language and grammar and communication is fundamental to how not only civilizations, but also tribes and groups operate, and hypothesizing how our language could have evolved based on our values and what we placed at the center of society. So a lot of this book, and he's open about this, deals in hypotheses because we don't have records of this, really. All we can do when we go back really, really far in time, aside from something like Rome, but like pre-Roman, like the records are scattered, there's huge gaps. We don't know how a lot of these civilizations were formed, obviously. So we create hypotheses based on what we know about humans operate throughout time and what could have, how things could have emerged. A lot like how they would rebuild a dinosaur based on a few skeletons and what we know about its size, and it would have to be this big and whatever. So a lot of it is based off of this other work called The Originary Hypothesis by it's a guy named Eric Gans. And so it references it a lot and kind of takes this foundational stuff and brings it into another light and kind of develops it like a lot of these books do. So if you wanted to go deeper into these ideas, I think there's a book here, The Originary Hypothesis, by Adam Katz. It collects a bunch of fucking essays and stuff. It's interesting stuff. So it was about how the earliest versions of language would have developed. And so they really frame it in, like, you have to imagine, how would this have happened? How did language actually emerge with, pre-classical people? And so he says it's about the center of society. So what is the center of society? It's not what we mean politically, like a centrist. What it means is, imagine, and he says this in the book, imagine, a group of cave people or Cro-Magnons or whatever it is, and they're a group and they're a pack, but they don't have a language, they don't really have a social hierarchy in any way, and they kill something, they kill an animal and they need it for food. And what you would do would be complete anarchy in the sense every man for himself. Anarchists would be like, no, that wouldn't be how it is. But let's just say it is anarchy. So, but then eventually you start fighting each other. And that's where the true competition comes in. You're trying to grab as much as you can because the other guy might have some. And then there's violence. So it hypothesized that the language, and as I'm going off on this, there might be people, this is very kind of heady stuff. And there might be people who say, no, you've got it wrong, or I'm doing my best here. And I'm going to try and make it as relevant as I can to, I might gloss over some stuff and deal in broad strokes, but I'm giving you the gist because while some people might disagree historically that this is how linguistics emerge and how language emerge, I still think there's enough here to be relevant to people. And it really gives you pause about how societies function. And like we talked about with the Signs of the Times, the interplay between the unknown world and the corporeal world, our world. And it really, this touches on the joining of the unknown world, the mystical world, the spiritual world, and our world. And all throughout time, different kingdoms and different societies still kept this model right up into, the medieval kings and everything. So this is kind of how that society started. So anyway, you have something at the center, something that people want, that everyone's kind of gathered around. And you invent this sort of communication to say, wait, everyone stop smashing each other's skulls. Let's figure out a way to divide this up. And this starts not with language, but with an ostensive sign, just like a hand gesture. You don't have language yet. and then eventually you turn these gestures, like monkeys would, into language, and then from language into writing. But he says there's three types of societies. There's an ostensive society, an imperative society, and a declarative society. So usually it's like an ostensive society. It's like doing signs about like warning and stopping and very, very basic stuff to try and organize this thing of value. And the thing of value is at the center. So you're already starting to evolve these sorts of signs, and one would argue rituals, for how to avoid conflict and avoid suffering. So that's kind of the foundation of your little community. It's like, we're going to make it so we can exist with the least amount of violence possible. And of course, that carries on to modern day. That's what laws are. That's what our concept of justice is, essentially. And then so that evolves from, an ostensive sign about how to categorize and organize things to an imperative communication. Now, an imperative is desire. Now you start saying, like, I want. Now, I want is a giant leap from where you were at communication, and you need to figure out a way to communicate to someone else that I want something. I want you to do something, or I want something you have, or I want something over there. And that's a whole fucking, lightning strike to your community. And how do you communicate that? Because now you've also created an agent in the other person. Now you're communicating with someone and you need to transact. Whereas before, you might have just been, you're kind of grouped together out of convenience and survival. But now you're starting to conceptualize other people that I have agency and they have agency, and I want something from them, but they might not want to give it to me. You see what I'm saying? So now we're dealing with imperatives. We're dealing with desires, and how we can, and that introduces the concept of no. More developed version. No, I want this. No, you can't. Why? And you see it starts to evolve. And this evolves into the classical area, what he would call a declarative society, which he gives the Greek Empire and the Israeli Empire, actually, as this is kind of like the Bible. You start dealing with the foundations of philosophy, which is declarative statements. Like, you can make a declarative statement about how something works or how something is. So those are like the three pre-classical phases you go as the language is developing, but you're also developing how you see the world, how you interact with each other. And the center is what you place at the center of society. So in a very, very early society, it might just be food. Right. And then it's how we can communicate and around that. But then you start adding more important things to the center. Like, here's things we can do to communicate. Here's things that we can do to, work with each other better. And basically the center starts to expand into less and less critical things. And that's how, so in this sense, this is anti-liberal in the sense that for a long, long time in modern society, people believe that language was just kind of random happenstance, that beneath all this, everyone's the same, everyone has the same desires, but not really, because if you go back to the foundation of societies, things we place at the center of society are different. And these manifest, like when we talked about when Julius Evola and Spengler, I think it was Evola who talked about the prime symbol in a civilization. Now, prime symbol in the broad European civilization, they would call the Faustian spirit of conquest, of exploration, of conquering the unknown, of climbing the tallest mountain. Whereas in ancient Chinese and Asian and Japanese, it was more about balance, the balance of humanity with nature. Whereas the Faustian spirit actually sees nature as more adversarial. And I don't think many people would disagree with this, but those are I think those are actually manifestations over hundreds, maybe thousands of years of the center of these civilizations manifesting into, eventually becoming these giant separate things. But you can reduce it down to the early days of how these civilizations formed and what values they put there, and how those are central. And in modern days, we see the center being destroyed. But so the idea was that the more stuff you place at the center, it's not just food, it might be behavior. And the idea was, if you conceptualize this, that the only reason human beings in these communities or civilizations can communicate with each other or exist is they're speaking through the center. The establishment of the center of civilization is almost like a living entity. And this is where mythology comes from. It's like our language is based off of this thing, this shared interest, this shared imperative. So we develop things around a value set. And over time, that expands and evolves. And that's where, that's how you end up with paganism, where it's like, at the center is food and survival. So you can conceptualize this is how you start praying to a deer god. We need more deer. We're trying to appeal to the center. We're trying to we have imperatives. Our imperatives, we want something. So we're trying to appeal to this thing at the center where we can get it. And then that's how this becomes deities. That's how you get the deer god. That's how you get the god of war. That's how you get the god of the ocean. Now this is I'm kind of glossing over some of the details, but what you're seeing at the center of society is almost a living organism. And it only exists because we create it, but we can only exist as a society because of it. Because every reference we have has to pass through it, because our communication has to pass through. It's like a prism in that sense. So we can only communicate through this kind of entity at the center of civilization. And it expands in different ways for different people based on geography, based on history. But you can also see this in modern day tribes, the types of rituals they have. And it's not so different than what we do. And it's a more perverted, corrupt version. And we have changed over time. But for every civilization, there's a central theme to it that we need to gather around. And this is why, like, it's hard to even say that people have truly original thoughts. Like, to explain certain concepts to ancient people from ancient Greece, for example, or people from ancient China, they actually don't have the words or the mental capability to even understand some of the things we would try and bring forward. Like the example he gave is at the center of our civilization right now in, let's say, America, North America, is we've replaced what it traditionally was, and we've replaced it with a very hyper liberal idea of universal justice. The concept of universal justice, you could probably not explain to someone from like ancient China. Like the idea of like total of equity, of fairness, like a lot of the stuff we're at now, like they wouldn't get it. There's no words for it, and it would seem completely alien. It would be like an alien showing up. It's like, have you considered just using the ocean for energy? The ocean, and put a spirit in the ocean. Like, what do you mean put a spirit? What? I would need to like explain 20 other things to even make that make sense, which we've kind of evolved over time. So the idea is that whatever's at the center is your linguistics, your communication, but also your values and also the reason you exist. And that's also why you're connecting with people. That's the only reason communities of any scale can exist. And if you think about it, you can probably find that in everyday life if you just kind of glance through history. And history is like sometimes the interesting thing he had said was at some point there is a shift where a person occupies the center. So before it might just be entities and spirits. That would be traditional paganism, like even going back. But then eventually you get an Odin. And we talked about this when we were talking about Thomas Carlyle, about the development of heroes over time. Like we won't tolerate in modern era the idea of a man as a god. That's too much for us. We won't do that. But there was a time, the first guy who occupied the center, and how he occupies the center is having, usually it's communication based, as Thomas Carlyle said. Like the story of Odin was Odin invented the runes. He invented the communication method for all the people. So, and then he was probably a real guy or an amalgamation of a few guys, but then you worship this man as God. And it's not far until that becomes a king. And the purpose of a king, as we've known, a king, an emperor, or whoever across the world, is someone who exists at the center of society and interfaces directly with the unknown. And I'll give you a good example of that. When we were talking about, what was that book? I don't think it was it might have been Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley. The idea, using Japan as an example, one of the reasons that liberalism got to creep into Japan was because the emperor was so separate from society that, in essence, the entire country was ran by the familial cults and the lower dynasties, because that was a case where the king is part of such a large kingdom, and he's not even a man at that point. And you'll know that the way people speak of kings and emperors, they don't see them as people. They see him as someone at the top who doesn't even really meddle in our affairs, but is trying there as a ceremonial and a sacred place at the center of society and at the top, who's kind of interfacing with the ancestors or the spirits or whatever, the deepest thing of your civilization. He's the guy who represents that, who's in charge of that. But in a geopolitical world, he was eventually cut out of the equation by a lot of these lower dynasties who were just hungry for power. And that's how they kind of take control of the politics. So, maybe that's doomed to happen under any sort of, as a civilization gets big enough, maybe that's doomed to happen. I don't know. But that's an example within the 19th century, I believe, where that would have happened. And you still have a king and queen, you still have an emperor, but they are almost secondary to politics. So the story of the modern era is how we became so separated from the center that and whatever is permitted in this world is almost just ornamental. Did you have any thoughts on that? I'm just going to look at this for a second.
No, yeah, that's
yeah. Hold on a second.
Damn. With the book shit, it's I'm just taking it in.
Yeah.
It's too much for me to.
It's funny when he talks about like the center of society almost has free will before humans have free will, because you're appealing to something that is almost it's the doorway to the spiritual world. Because you have to understand that these people, up until fairly recently, viewed that, and this was sort of like a proto-scientific theory, that we have our world, the corporeal world, where all the stuff is, but then there's this other world, and that it's not actually separate. And we've established this before, that there is interplay between the unknown world and the real world. And that's why you appeal to the center, because you think you're interfacing with something you don't understand and trying to approximate that. A good thing he talks about is like, you'll start to have rituals trying to appeal to the center, to appeal to the spirit, to appeal to the civilization itself. Because like at this point, your real world civilization, your politics is so ingrained with like this spiritual, actually, like other, not paranormal, but otherworldly world. Like they're the same thing. So you're almost talking to your own civilization, and that's how to conceptualize it. You're talking to the other world, but by which you're talking to yourself. And that's, you can talk to fate this way. And the thing is, like you create these rituals, and then if you appeal to the center, to appeal to this other world, and something doesn't happen, you start to think, oh my God, we did the ritual wrong. Someone fucked up. So we did the wrong thing. We said the wrong thing, or maybe someone wasn't into it. So you're seeing the birth of the idea that to do this right, it needs to be identical. And that's, again, if you're in a world where that concept didn't exist, that's a fucking lightning strike to your brain. Like the idea of duplication, that rights need to be adhered to the same over time for them to be effective. And that then you're seeing a birth of a larger language. Like we need something that's duplicable for this to be effective. And that's and you can see how you get to a written language.
It's interesting because that's kind of, I could be wrong, but I feel like this is a stand-in. This is pre-scientific, scientific method, pre-Renaissance, pre-medieval. This is we're talking about ancient history, right here. So, I mean, this is a situation where people they're barely speaking, so they can't understand the idea of like cause and effect, essentially. But they can understand cause and effect, but they don't understand, like, I don't even know. It's so complicated to even describe this because they're so basic. But like they don't get.
Something's there. Something's there.
Yeah. So all I know, look, I don't know why the whole world is almost God of the gap. So the entire world is spirits and God, which is to say, I have to create abstract entities that represent these things because I know so little about them, and I need to be able to describe them to understand them. But I know for a fact that if I stand here and do the thing with this thing, then this XYZ will happen. Like if I stand here and I place this seed in the ground and I throw the water this way, then next year I will have a plant. That's not a scientific thing. That's that's farming. But you could describe that as a ritual. And they had many other rituals that, for better or worse, that they performed because they got the impression that this is something. And again, not trying to railroad it, but relating it back to the center, the idea that the earth is something that you work, and the earth is something your neighbor and your brother works. And so you can take knowledge and rituals from your brother and your neighbor relating to the earth and repeat them because you have the earth in common. Yeah. And so in a sense, this is learning. It's the basis of almost of science and civilization, but it's also the basis of spirituality and religion and belief.
And to this day, we still look at, if you remove spirituality from it, because some people get lost in that, don't like it, but we still, as Westerners, now more than ever, I think, see nature as something to exist in balance with. Some parts of nature we don't understand, but we know like it's important to us, and we treat it as if it's an entity that we can almost appeal to. Not as much as before, but it's still there. And
honestly, fuck scorpions. But aside from that, I totally agree.
Yeah, fuck scorpions, always stinging us in the back. and laughing at us as we take them across. The Jews of the animal kingdom.
Jews of the animal kingdom.
It's like, and like the YouTube algorithms listening to us up in this point, like, okay, no, all right, shadow ban. Oh no, but the core of this is that I think in a lot of, I don't want to say atheistic, but like in a lot of materialist views of the past, they see like, oh my God, these people thought there were gods and they were slaves to the gods, and that the world's cruel, and they use it to explain why the world is cruel. It's not the case, because it's actually the opposite, that people were convinced that not only was there this world, but they could affect it. They believed they could affect and interface with that world and do things to either please or displease it. So it's actually, by doing this, is people trying to have control over the unknown in some way. And they're kind of teasing it out, and kind of they're fumbling around in the dark trying to figure it out. But the fact that they're moving in the dark means something, whereas animals wouldn't move in the dark. They're completely reactionary. This isn't being reactionary. This is being proactive in the world. And the greatest civilizations, you could say, even though you might think it's goofy mythology, but it's like at the very core of it is people trying to figure out the world. This is the birth of the scientific method, if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah.
But it's also like we're taking control in whatever control we can. Like even if the idea that there's a God and you demand to talk to God is cool. You see what I'm saying? Like the idea that there's a guy who created everything, and I'm picking up the phone. I'm going to call him. I'm going to figure out what he wants, and we're going to negotiate. That's fucking great. Like the fact that we came up with that, or we tried to do that, or that's like seems natural to us is fucking. That's why fuck animals. They didn't do that. There's no deer that tried to pick up the phone, for Christ.
I ain't scared of you motherfuckers.
Yeah, and also the idea, and because in that sense, the materialist people, they would look at kings as tyrants. There's no such thing as a king that isn't a tyrant. The correct way to look at it is like and there's a whole part in the book that explains how it's called like the big man, the man who takes the center of society, usually by force, by conquest, by adventure. Even classical stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh. What's the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh? He goes out and comes back. That is the traditional hero's journey. He goes and comes back and brings the boons to the community. And that's why he's great, because he's a man of the people in his community. And he went into the unknown and came back. The most fundamental thing is that's what every king does. And the king is seen as something other than human. So when we think of a tyrant, you would think of like a Saddam Hussein who's got a bunch of rapist sons, and they can go around fucking shooting gold AK-47s. That's why you don't like a tyrant, because what they would argue is he is of the material world. He became a king not because he was or a leader, but essentially a king, not because he did anything that he negotiated with the center and was absorbed into it, and the people were okay with it. He took power. And a lot of these kings do. This happens all the time. This happened in history of through like trickery and conniving and conquest and slitting the right throats. And that's how you become king. But whenever that happens, you are at a distance from the people. And that's why you end up so corrupt. They think every king was corrupt, but a king or a monarch or an emperor or whoever done correctly, it's like they're seen as something other than human. You know, they might live in a bigger house, but they also know they don't get to do a lot of the stuff you get to do. And this, even Hans Hermann Hoppe was talking about this. Like the life of a king wasn't just a Caligulan sitting around fucking every day and eating grapes. It's like it was you are sacred. You exist as a sacred object. You are objectified in these things, and so you almost become more than human. So you don't even get to, like, people will remember your name, but they remember your name because you have a responsibility, and you don't actually exist really in the material world. You exist, it's material in the sense that you are representing the civilization as a figurehead that is being thrust into the unknown. So like that's why I say, like, a lot of people see, I don't want a king because I don't want a king to like take all my money and fuck my wife. I'm like, that is like a corrupted king. In the sense that, you know, in your perfect world, whatever ideology you have in your perfect world, there's someone who could corrupt it and do it wrong. So, but that is that you see the existence of the tyrant as almost an example, as evidence of, you know, why this breaks down and where this breaks down and the reasons why it breaks down. And you get into sort of Machiavellian stuff where I'm a king because I was installed here. And if you read The Prince by Machiavelli, the one takeaway I got when I read that was the whole purpose of if you're like a landed gentry or you're an aristocrat that's given a country, the first thing you got to do is get the people to love you. You got to you have to appeal to the current system, and that includes the clerical class, whatever the hierarchy is that you're the head of, like if they don't love you, then they are going to cast you out. They will find a way. The machine that you're the head of will find a way to grind you into dust. And that's kind of what that book was about. Like maybe it's through Machiavellian means, but or like saying the right thing, but that you realize that's the reality you're living in. And one of the main things about the center, the reason why people see the center in whatever form is because it distributes. So and then we start seeing the concept of distribution in society, and what we were talking about before, where this is kind of the birth of markets, but you're appealing to something knowing that I want something, it distributes fairly, it distributes if the right things and the right motions or the right sacrifices are made to it. So now you have the birth of a transactional society, and then you've got the birth of markets. And like we said before, markets are not inherently, the modern view of capitalism and how capital functions is just a graduation, almost different than trade and markets and money, because money existed before capitalism. So, but that's how this stuff kind of comes out, and the purpose is that's why I want. This is against the liberal idea that everyone's the same and we're only different for cosmetic or frivolous reasons. That and there is a theory of they're called semantic primes, and this is interesting, and this is true. That in every civilization, whether it's Asian, European, South American, there are certain concepts that exist in all of them that kind of came up foundationally. And you can kind of know a semantic prime where it's like, you're not able to explain it. It's so fundamental, you can't explain it without appealing to itself. So, in ours, he made the argument, I'm not sure, this was where people might differ, but a lot of our civilizational semantic primes right now are based off of Jean Locke, that our liberal modern civilization and everything that occupies the center was founded, post Enlightenment, and the idea of justice. Justice, our concept of justice and fairness, not as a reactive thing, but something you pursue. It's a proactive thing, because justice traditionally, it's like eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You stole it, you get it back. It's restoring balance. But justice as almost a proactive thing that you're seeking out and you're thrusting out in the world to do, that's a new concept. You couldn't explain that so it's like the idea of fairness as conquest. That's weird. That's never existed before in society. And the moment you think about it, you're thinking, holy shit, how does that make any sense? But that exists right now at the center of our civilization.
Is that Lockean? Or is that...
Well, the idea of like an objective universal concept of justice and fairness and like the social... Like the idea of that, like liberalism, you couldn't explain that to an ancient person. So it might have grown out of that, but at the center of society is this sort of universal human rights or universal, like the non-aggression principle.
I see what you mean.
From that. Would have grown out of that, and that you can't explain that to a Muslim.
Something that exists in the ether. It's not something that's relational between you and your neighbor. It's something that exists as like, it's like the physics, like the fabric of reality, which means that you can travel to the other side of the globe and enforce it, even though that person's never seen you before.
Yeah. And also the idea that how we lost this in the West is basically the decentralization of power. So as you have more power being granted to, let's say markets and stuff, like the idea, like they would draw the conclusion that really the creation of money was kind of the first thing that led to what this is, because like when you have money, you kind of decentralize power, but prior to that, the civilizational center would be the prime source of influence and communication and power and distribution. And then if you introduce more methods of distribution in any way, you're decentralizing power a bit. Now you've got power centers that can emerge underneath you and then exert influence over time. So that leads us to, I guess, the main point that he makes, and I think some people may disagree with this, but this is why I don't think it's possible to go backwards. Like he really says, like the idea that we need to find a new philosopher king, I don't think that's coming down the pipe. And we can talk all day about how great that would be if we could, how do we reestablish power at the center? It might not be possible. Like I've always said, the big thing I've been saying recently, which kind of gets people's back up, but the only people who can defeat liberalism are the people who have been through liberalism. It's not going to be the based Muslims or the based Chinese, because they're not against liberalism. A lot of times they're against America. They might be against the materialist manifestations, but like they can fall slaves to global neoliberalism the same way as anyone, because many of them are quite stupid and many of them are peasants and illiterate. So you think they got the fucking horses to fight a truly surgical liberal ideology? No, they don't. The only people who can kind of combat liberalism are the ones who've been through it, who actually understand it, and who can kind of unwork it or rework it or something from within. But the changing of the power centers, especially, it's something that no one else understands. But the absolute pinnacle of corruption of it is what we have now, which is like globalist, corporatist, fucking, but still identity based, the commodification of identities and things like that.
Yeah.
And like we said in the sign of the times, like as a civilization is falling, things start fracturing more and more and more. There's more time micromanaging. There's more definitions. There's more categorization for the sake of categorization, because there is no center. Because at the center of our civilization, we have put that. We have just installed the idea of tolerance, and there is no center. So it's a self-devouring thing, and we're seeing that manifest in our. We got nothing else to cling to, and that's like in the sign of the times. He says the only reason you can trick people to cling to it is if you introduce something worse, which is kind of what you see with the trans stuff. It's like that's the story of conservatives. Like I said, the story of the conservative is saying I'm clinging to this monster that's just eating itself because it's better than that dark hellhole you've just opened up. But still, that's just a short-term cope, as far as I know. And there's one part in here where he actually goes into the role of the king. Just to back up what I was saying, I'm just going to read. You can say the king should rule because someone must occupy the center, and the occupation of the center relies upon unanimous attention involving the suspension of resentment towards the center, and that the king occupies the center according to traditions and practices practiced at the exclusion of the rivalries expected to emerge once the transition of the new king was necessary. Here, rule and sacrality are one, but the identity of rule and sacrality cannot be maintained because the divine king must be identified with the origin of the community, meaning that such an order rests upon human sacrifice. So just what I was saying before, the idea of a king is almost a human sacrifice. Instead of slitting their throat to the gods, you're putting forward a guy who's going to be like a proto-human or an extra human. You're sacrificing this guy to the unknown, and he knows he's going to die. And he makes the point in the book that the only way to elect a new person at the center is for that person to choose one. It can't be democratic. It can't be, usually can't even be his son. The idea of a hereditary line is not even taken as a given. Like, oh, he's his son, he's automatically, unless that center chooses an heir, it can't really be connected to the same power center, because then you could have all these other extra sources of influence, the mercantile class, his friend who hates him. You can have all these zones of influence. That's how it gets corrupted. Right. And so the idea is now, that's why we say, like, you hear this, you're like, oh man, we should try and get back to that. I'm like, you can't. Like, there is no center. That's why, like, from here moving forward, I think it's important to know this. I think it's important to keep this in mind, because people might disagree with some of the conclusions, but I think there's enough here that it makes sense and it's evident in the rest of society. And it's good to understand how, like, the center of society functions and how ours doesn't exist. But also, I don't think you can just blow on that and get the fire to come back. Yeah. So whatever we do in the future, take this as where we were and how things operated. Right. Whatever comes in the future, it's not going to be just a rewind. And I don't think you can have a philosopher king. And I think those who are looking for a philosopher king who's going to, that's how you end up with a Bill Gates. That's how you end up with a cult of personality. The entire reason of a cult of personality exists because we're grasping for something that rhymes with what we had before. But that's how you get tyrants. You're more likely to get a tyrant that way.
Well, yeah. Sorry, not to derail, but just for a second, Fauci, right? Why is it that Fauci has any credibility from square one? He shouldn't, because from square one, he's lied about everything, and everybody who's paying any attention knows that he's been lying about everything, and he's involved, and he's up to his fucking eyes in corruption and fraud. So why is it that he's still all over the place and most normies trust him? And most normies trust him because most normies look to other normies and they see, now, Fauci is a name that you know. Fauci is on the TV, which is in the center of my house, in the center of your house. Fauci is, in this context, Fauci becomes a center. Fauci almost becomes a demigod, and they treat him like a demigod. It doesn't matter what he say. It's the science. Trust the science, right? And then this becomes like a cult. And it is a cult. Yeah. And that, I mean, so I think the thing that I love about this is, like you said, even if you disagree with the conclusions of it, it's like a mechanistic, anthropological analysis of people's beliefs and behaviors. And I think that that you can apply that to a lot of stuff.
Yeah, here's just a couple more quotes because I feel like I should read more from the actual book, but is about just the Fauci thing and how someone occupies the center. So it's like once a human occupies the center, he becomes part of these ritual exchanges and mythical narratives. He ascends to power, acts, and distributes in prescribed ways with the collaboration of central beings. Systems of signs are generated to have been read in order to have the prescribed activities in the right ways. And so that's the emergence of a priestly class or a clerical class. A priestly class of specialists devotes itself to reading these signs, which is to say, to conveying the meanings of the signifying center to the occupied one. So that's how you have the king and then his court. So like it's part of you start to see this machine evolve. The reading of signs is as ritualized as the ruling, even if the need to interpret opens up some space to deal with exceptional circumstances. Anyone might be able to imagine that a man who happened to be king might now not prove to be the most qualified if a kingdom-wide job search would be held, but he has ascended and now rules through a complex, time-tested process that draws upon the talent and accumulated means of the entire community in a way that would not be replicable if there were a constant search for someone who might be better in the abstract. So really, a lot of the times the king he's not the smartest, he might not be the toughest, but for whatever reason, he is representative of that community. He has the roots there, and that's how and he doesn't need to be the most conniving guy to do his job. It might help him write better poetry and make better investments and whatever, but the idea of him as an extension of the community is interesting, because if you were to listen to a lot of people who are anti-traditional, they would say the king is just the guy who's in charge and we're all his slaves. Not really. That's not how they saw it. That's not how the people saw it. That's not how it actually worked. And that's how you see what we have now is a grim parody of what that is. That's how you get Fauci. That's how you get like this. He's a fucking conniving piece of shit idiot, and he's still worshipped. And people who even question him will have his followers assault them. Like he is, and he just showed up. No one knew him before. He showed up. What's he representative of? What is he an extension of? Fauci is an extension, really, if you want to talk about this. Fauci exists as an extension of that particular community in opposition to us. That's the only reason. He's a guy that he came from the community. They love him so much because he is against what we are against. They're against the right. And here's a guy who like talks back to the right. He talks back to Rand Paul at a Senate hearing or something. And he's on science, and they're against science. So we need to believe whatever he says, not because we even like him, but he represents our hatred of these other people. So if you want to talk about what's at the center of society, the center of their little community is opposition to whatever the fuck we believe, to the point where they get this motherfucking faggot up there who's just a wrong, schemy, rat-faced little liar. But they have mugs of him like Dr. Fauci, patron saint of, fuck around and find out. You know what I mean? Like that, people buy that. They buy that. They buy candles with him as a saint and burn those candles in their fucking living room. And that is a ritual. That is their cobbled together ritual. Imagine that. Anyway, I think that pretty much settles it. There's a lot you could go into with this stuff. There's parts I didn't get to cover about the nature of mythical agents, but I really wanted to get to like how these communities, it's scalable. You can see this, like what is at the center. Is it a sort of idealism? What value set? And you can see very easily, like this book goes into more about how it's decayed in modernist liberal society. A lot of that goes without saying. I bet a lot of people listening to this already have a list of ways where they can see what I'm saying in society about, ask any American about like what's going on in American civilization, which I might not even call a civilization. I kind of see America and Canada as vassals of a central Anglo civilization. And it's falling apart in different ways, but in unison. So I think you can chart the decay of America with the decay of the United Kingdom and the decay of Canada. Mm-hmm. Just the tiny details differ, but what we are seeing is the decline of that particular empire. And I guess Australia kind of snuck out the back. Is doing its own thing.
No, they're chasing it too, man. They're circling the drain.